Welcome to the Raw Heart and Soul podcast. This morning I have with me Peter Jess. Welcome, Peter.
G'day, how are you?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Tonya.
So I wanted to speak to you. I've had an interest in football for 25 years. I actually grew up in Canberra, and my father and then my brother played rugby league, but I moved to Melbourne here 23 years ago. I started following the Western Bulldogs, became a very big fan, heard of you during that time, but really picked up on what you were doing around Liam Picken because he was one of my favourite football players. And
yes,
I followed his concussion injuries, as I'm sure did many Western Bulldogs football fans. But his story and what has happened to him post injury and after retirement really fascinates me. Again, I work with people in corrective exercise. So the brain and plasticity of the brain is something that is a big area of my study. So I wanted to ask you a few questions. With the current climate, with the AFL now talking about, or within the media talking about changing the rule from concussion injuries, people being out of the game for 12 days up to 30 days, I want to touch on that. But I also want to go back a little bit and find out what got you first interested in in managing AFL football players. When did that come about? Because you're a practicing accountant, I understand.
I am. I first got involved in football via my cousin Jim Jess, who played with the Tigers.
Right.
And he asked me, originally his father was doing his contract. Mm-hmm. And he asked me, because at the time I was an accountant, if I could have a look at it and see what I thought of his contract with Richmond. Mm-hmm. They offered him a base salary of $10,000 and I think about $1,500 a game. He asked me what I thought of it. I said, well, that's okay for the first quarter of the season. What are you going to do for the rest? And he was quite shocked anyway. So he said, well, do you want to come and meet the guys at Richmond Football Club and see if we can get a deal done? I said, sure. So prior to going to Richmond, I rang Ian Collins of Carlton and said, what are you likely to offer us if Jim came across to you? And so he set some baselines. So I went down to Richmond with Jim and they asked me what he wanted, and I said he wants $100,000 to play base and he wants $10,000 for the use of his image. And that was the start of it.
What year was that?
1980.
Was that the start of really when managers started to get involved with football players?
Yeah, there was a couple around at the time. And I was probably one of the first to take it seriously.
Yeah. And how did the football clubs take that? Because I guess you're the middleman, and from my understanding of, and this is a very out of the circle kind of opinion because I'm obviously not within those circles, but from what I understand, the media don't necessarily love you and football clubs don't necessarily love you because you're that person in the middle who is in between them and what they want.
Well, I mean, I've never sought to be loved by people other than my family, but quite simply, the football club took it quite badly that I would come in and asked for that amount of money. But I said, well, this is a benchmark. Mm-hmm. You paid $120,000 for John Patura and Jim's a better player than him. So, but look, let's not cut straws. Jim will play for the $100,000 base plus $10,000 for his image. And that's what they agreed to. He signed up for 3 years on that.
Was it unusual to ask for that image part of it as well?
I think I was the very first player to ask, or player, manager to seek payment for the use of his image.
When I was researching for this podcast episode and to interview you, I came across a video with you sitting on a panel. I think it was actually the Footy Show, and you represented Nicky Winmar. Is that right?
I did. Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yeah. That negotiation seemed to be quite volatile.
Well, not really. I think basically is this. I've acted for a number of Indigenous sports people, and generally they come from a belief system that if a white fella tells them this is what they're going to do, that they generally do it. So Nicky was promised that if he played, really good football in that year, then they would increase his payment. So I think he finished in the first 2 or 3 in the best and fairest. Mm. And then when he went and said, well, okay, what are you going to pay me? And they said the same as last year. He said, well, hang on, you promised me that if I played well that I'd get paid better. So that was the start of it.
Yeah. What do you say to the elements of the media, or what do you say to people who say that you detract from the relationship between the club and the player?
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
So your work is to, I imagine, and you got into it to represent the player and to protect the player. And the way I'm going down, the way I'm leading to with this is with the concussion rule. But you care about the player rather than the football team. Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, like the thing is that I have a long sort of history of working for players and other types of people in sport. My experience is extensive. I've acted for players in New Zealand, China, Japan, various other parts of Asia, various other parts of Europe, the UK, Ireland, France, Spain. So I've got a unique perspective, as well as sportsmen in the US, sports people in the US and in the South Americas. So, there's very few people in Australia who've had the breadth of experience in dealing in all those jurisdictions. So, I've got a unique knowledge set that I bring to the table for people who I work for.
Fair enough. When did it become obvious to you, or has it become obvious, that the health of the current and former AFL players, in terms of the concussion rules, may not have been in the best interest of the players? So the rules surrounding the concussion, we're talking 20 years ago, I'm guessing, that it became pretty obvious that they weren't being looked after.
Well, look, my first foray into this was in 2008 with the AFL. And that was because I was seeing the emerging science and medicine coming out of the US. If you overlay that we are a 360 game, that we have collisions at speed, the same thing was going to happen. Mm-hmm. I've just got another call. When I was seeing the science and the medicine coming from the US warning about, concussion and subclinical concussions. So, and how it was generally in 4 pillars. That was mood, behaviour, cognition and motor skills. So I started to then engage with various scientists throughout the world to try and get a better understanding of it, and also local scientists. So then I started to see an emerging problem with the players who I used to manage when they're 18 and 19, how they were suddenly now displaying the same types of symptoms as what they were seeing in the US. So there seemed to be a direct relationship between the length of time you played football and the neurological impairments that then flowed from that.
What sort of neurological impairments are we talking about for the person who doesn't understand that?
Basically, the most catastrophic are mood and behaviour. So that means you have problems with, your anger management, rage, excitability, which means that you have an increased risk-taking, which then means in gambling, drugs, poor investments. You have problems in terms of domestic violence and a whole range of other stuff that flow from that.
From what you've seen, and I'm just going to keep it to Australia because I know how big and broad this is in America and the NFL, In terms of what you've seen in Australia, how many people do you think this affects?
Well, we've looked at 185 past players at the moment, and it's running at about 80% of those have measurable structural damage to their brain, and that generally means is that then there is functional impairment of some sort in those four pillars that we discussed. So what we found is that it's dose related. The longer you play, the more likely you are to have the damage, and it's quite catastrophic. In America, it's running at about 99% of players who have played 10 years or more that they have neurological impairments.
That's a massive figure, 80 or 90%.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're dealing with. I mean, I don't know what it is at the community level, because when we did our study, and that was peer reviewed and published by Dr. Alan Pierce, we found that there was no distinct differentiation between the level of football you played and the damage. So we're sitting on a community pandemic or a tsunami of damage that we're not dealing with.
That's incredible. I used to work as a sports trainer for one of our local football clubs, and I know that my husband's a chiropractor, and he was in partnership with me doing that. We had a really hard time at that local level of getting, and this was women's football, getting girls off the field because they wanted to keep playing, but also we had parents on the sideline saying, let them go back on, let them go back on. And my husband's a doctor, he's a chiropractor, so doing the full concussion proper tests and not seeing them fit to play, to go back on the field, yet having so much pressure from the sidelines and from the football clubs to put those girls back on the field. So I can imagine that level of intensity, and when you've got huge amounts of money and on the line and premierships on the line, that must intensify 100-fold.
It does, but I mean, the fact that Dylan Grimes was only found to be suffering from concussion 48 hours post-match tells us that whilst the theory trotted out is that he had a delayed concussion. Well, there's no such thing in science. You either have a concussion or you don't, and if you have a concussion, the symptoms can present over a time period. So if you don't actually have the proper testing tools to determine whether in fact a concussive event has happened, then this is where we have this other nonsense about a delayed concussion. It just doesn't exist. You've either got it or else you don't.
So how long is that period after a concussion? Like, is the testing done immediately? Because I know someone who recently had a concussion and it didn't present until it was from an accident, but it was happened on the Thursday morning. Hers presented with vomiting on the Saturday morning.
Yeah, I mean, 48 hours is standard, but I mean, it really, depends on, the severity of the, concussion in the first instance. Primarily what we have at the moment is we deal with a concussion based on symptom presentation, not brain analysis. The brain electroconnectivity is what tells us whether the brain has in fact resolved itself and is back to normal.
So do we need to then look at, and is this being done, because I'm not sure, do we need to look at people who are playing sports or at this elite level, we're talking about AFL, have their brains scanned or tested prior to the season starts so that we've got somewhere to compare it from? Because we might have people who have already got this damage, but we've got no baseline to start them from. So when we go and test them after they've had concussion, they might, we don't know what that baseline or that start point for them is. So they might have damage or they might not.
Well, I mean, we've got to devolve to science. I mean, up until recently, it was always on, the neuropsychometrics, which, for me, are not valid in terms of being a sensible biomarker to know whether somebody has a problem that is pre-existing or is likely to increase the likelihood of them suffering more, concussive outcomes than other people. So, what I've always said is that anybody coming into the system, because we know that the people who are at risk are in the age bracket 16 to 24, which is most of the draftees. So my primary test would be to have a transmagnetic scan in the first instance when people are first drafted, to understand the brain connectivity, so that are all the parts of the brain talking to each other? Are they processing the data at the right speeds? And if they're not, then that person should be sidelined for further tests to ensure that we don't have, the presentation of pre-existing neurological problems into an elite sport level where they're more likely to unfold quickly.
How supportive is the AFL of that conversation?
Well, you simply have to have a look and see whether it's been brought in, and it's not.
Right, so they're not supportive at the moment, because I'm gathering that evidence has been presented to them.
Well, look, the thing is this. It's taken me 30... Yeah, okay.
Can you still hear me?
I can, but not very well. Let me see if I can fiddle with things here. Is that better?
I can hear you perfectly fine.
Yep.
Good.
Yep. Okay. Sorry.
That's okay. So you said that it's taken 13 years for that to change from 6 days, was it, to 13 days?
Yeah. Look, the problem is this: is that the AFL relies on junk science. A lot of the stuff that they rely on has not been peer reviewed, has not been validated. I'm sceptical of a lot of the science that's trotted out because it's not peer reviewed, and it has not been robustly tested. I mean, no better demonstrated than the consensus group. The concussion in sports group had a firm belief that you could return after 14 days, that your brain would normalise and that you were ready to go back into play. So when I spoke to the co-chairman, Professor Paul McCrory, I said to him, well, all the science that I've looked at tells me that's not right. Then he said to me, well, look, the basis is that you should have 14 days complete rest, 7 days of testing, and then return on the 28th day at the earliest, right? So yet, if you look at every website, they still trot out the same consensus in sport, scientific babble, which is complete nonsense.
Yep.
That you're ready to go after 7 to 14 days. I mean, there is no evidence to suggest that is correct. All of the evidence. I mean, the last research paper that I saw presented in September 2020 reaffirmed that if you're in the 16 to 24 age group, the first concussion, you must have 30 days off. The second concussion, between 30 to 45 days off to recover. And if it's your second in the same season, then you should not play out the season.
So why are we not doing that?
Well, I mean, that's a question we've got to ask ourselves. I mean, they even presented that at the coroner's report for Danny Frawley and Shane Tuck.
I was going to ask you about that. Were you following their cases or their stories?
Yeah. I mean, the first inquiry, where the widow did not seek independent advice, meant that we had the AFLPA and the AFL dog and pony show. They'd simply trotted out, science that was flawed, didn't get to the core issues of the matter. So, yeah, it was a waste of time in terms of finding out whether it was safe or not to play. But the Tuck, the coronial inquest is totally different. There's a far more in-depth view of the science and the far greater look at what in fact is happening with the science and medicine.
And that brings us to the subject of CTE. So can you explain that to us? Chronic traumatic, I can never say the last word,
encephalopathy. So basically, if you break it down, right, chronic means persistent, trauma means being hurt,
injury,
and encephalopathy is either structural or functional damage to the brain. So basically, to get CTE, it's got to be dose-related and it's got to be over a period of time for it to be chronic, traumatic, and encephalopathy, which is a structural or functional damage to your brain.
Why cannot scientists, doctors diagnose that condition prior to
Well,
autopsy?
I think neuropathologically, it is difficult to understand and diagnose because it is deep tissue. So that means to diagnose it neuropathologically, you need to slice open somebody's brain. But what happens is that, as I said before, is that we know from the families, friends of people who have had CTE that they're 4 pillars of the disease.
It's significantly affected.
Yeah. So what happens is, I said before, mood, behaviour, cognition, and motor skills are all part of, the anecdotal view, but you can actually see encephalopathy, right? But you can't see chronic traumatic encephalopathy. But you can gauge somebody who's had an encephalopathy now with the different types of lenses we have for the different types of scans.
Okay. So how has the case last year, and I have to look at my notes for it, it was the insurance payout to Sean Smith, the $1.4 million. You were involved in that?
Yes, it was 1.8 million.
1.8. I'm staying corrected. How has that, or has that had an impact on the way players look at their health and insurance companies look at players?
Look, basically the first thing we had to get over was the Bradford Hill causation paradigm. Once we're able to establish that, that is where exposure leads to an event. Once you can establish that, then the causation problem goes out the window, and that's what we're able to establish on 2 medical panels that reviewed Sean's brain and the types of injuries that he had, with all of the medical presentations and scans that we put to them. They decided that the lesions on his brain were caused by playing football, and that he had an industrial disease created from playing footy. It was a direct relationship to his employment, and therefore they paid it out. These were 2 panels, independent medical panels. So as far as I'm concerned, the causation issue was no longer a problem in determining playing football and brain damage.
Going back to what we were just talking about before, if we were giving MRI scans to those recruits, so coming in between 16 and 24, those kids, would we then have more evidence?
I wouldn't do a scan for them based on that. I think because their brains have not fully formed, the better scan is a transmagnetic scan to see which parts of the brain are actually talking to, because much of the damage is at the microscopic level, and unless you have drilled down and have the lens that'll drill down to the molecular level, such as seeing sheared nerve ends, etc., you actually won't get to the core damage.
So how can we see the core damage? And so it's back to those 4 pillars again. So it's from looking from the outside in, and I agree with you, it needs to be done scientifically. But for the average person who is looking at this, they would say, well, it seems very grey. Like there seems to be a lot of grey areas in this.
There's no grey area. There's none. Quite clearly, the first step is you have to provide causation, which we've done. The Bradford Hill paradigm for causation is clearly been established in the sport, right? So that's not an issue. If you play football, right, and you play long enough, you will have neurological damage, full stop.
What do we then talk to, or what do you say to parents who are wanting their children to play, or kids that are wanting to play? Like brains at the age of 6 or 5, I would say more susceptible because they're that much younger and that much softer and that much more easy to damage.
Well, look, you only need to look at the research paper presented by Dr. Vicky Anderson from the Royal Children's Hospital in the last 6 months, where she examined the paediatrics of a number of children who had, concussions. And she then not only found that there was neurological damage, but she said it presented long-term problems for their ability to learn. So for me is that, if you have somebody wanting to play a sport that's likely to hurt them, then they must have informed consent. And informed consent is a well-developed theory in our laws that you have to be at least 18 years of age to have informed consent. So unless you're 18 years of age, you then run into the position of, okay, are you acting in, if we know that the game is not safe and could have a high problem if you play it over a longer period of time, creating damage to your child, then, you'd have to question, the ethics of you sending your child out to play if it's not safe.
What would you like to see happen in terms of, so you would like to see the rule change to 30 days post-concussion minimum?
Yeah, basically, I've said that we need to switch the paradigms to focus on prevention and mitigation strategies. So that is we have to delve into science to make sure we've got rapid point of care diagnostic tools that actually give us comfort that if something does happen, that we can diagnose it properly and therefore treat it. Because the biggest issue we have in our sport is the subclinical concussions that aren't diagnosed, can't be diagnosed by SCAT5, which is the current modality that
the basic testing,
the AFL insists we use. I mean, quite simply, it is not
enough.
Repeat, it is not fit for purpose.
Yep.
So what we've got to do is look at the multimodality. I mean, look, this is going to cost a lot of money, and we've got to get used to it. Is that, we should be in a constant state of refining what we're doing on the pitch to reduce this problem. I think if you're seeing in America, the trend is now is that middle class people aren't playing collision-based sports. It's now being devolved as a working class sport because it is a way of these people to get out of the ghettos. Other than that, there is a significant shift away from people who are middle class wondering if their child is going to be damaged. It's not reached that yet here, but it may well do in time.
What do you say? So, for example, to Nick Rewalt, who I know said in the media that given the choice, if he was to be pulled out under the concussion rule, yep, and it was his only opportunity to play an AFL grand final, and he can't at the moment override it, but what would you say to him about around those comments that he would choose to play?
Well, the first thing he's got to do, he has to do the multimodality test to prove that his brain has returned to normal and that it's not likely going to be damaged by him being concussed again. Now, the tests that he has done are not sensitive enough to find if his electromagnetic brainwave system has returned to normal. That's the problem, because that means is that your the frontal lobal cortex, which is a decision-making part of your brain, is dysfunctional. And we've known that from research done by the AFL, which was Michael McDeasy and Paul McCorry, where they found that the brain, after a clinical concussion, was still dysfunctional 30 days after the event.
So they're not able to make an informed decision because it's been
properly tested.
Yeah, but because it's been altered by the injury that they've sustained.
Yeah, I mean, look, Nick, God bless him, he's like most blokes that don't address the science.
Yeah. They just want to get out and play football.
Want to play football, but, science is warning us. I mean, look, the fact is you get one brain, and your brain does not recuperate the same as a torn bloody hamstring. If you have a torn hammy, he'd be out for 4 weeks, but his brain is something slightly different. So in that context, it makes no sense to me, that if you're more worried about your hamstring than your brain, then, you finish up with what you deserve.
Do you think we need to be educating, or the AFL needs to be educating? Well, someone needs to be educating the AFL at the high levels if they're using old testing, but would it be helpful if players were educated and informed? And
well, it's a must. I mean, I've said that right from the start, is that, knowledge is king. You make informed decisions with knowledge. if you don't have knowledge, you don't make informed decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Where was it going? Okay, who covers the players' insurance? Like, who pays for their insurance? And I'm talking long term. So after they stop playing, are players able to get health insurance for things like
They
this?
get health insurance. That's not a problem. The problem is if they have chronic orthopedic or neurological problems, generally and that was one of the problems that I had with the AMP policies, is that they weren't fit for purpose. So they excluded neurological problems from being able to be classified as totally and permanently disabled.
Mm. So how do we support families around those?
Well, that's what I'm trying to set up, this, concussion settlement trust, to make sure the AFL behaves like a good corporate citizen and funds it at a level that makes sense.
Yeah. Do you think that, I guess it comes back to being informed, and like if they were to give consent, so if players were to give consent, if they had all of the information and then still chose to play.
I mean, it just defies belief that you turn up to somebody and say, look, you play 10 years in this and there's a 90% chance you are going to have a long-term neurological impairment that could finish up with the early onset of dementia and a whole range of other
domestic violence, like all those things that we see in the community.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen it time and time again. Our newspapers are filled with dysfunctional behaviour of elite collision-based sportsmen.
Mm. I
mean, the big worry for me is the tsunami of problems that we're going to have with women that we're just not, prepared for, because what we're finding is that the dose relation to them is far less than men, so they're more likely to be damaged in a shorter period of time, as we saw with Jacinta Barclay. I mean, she played less than 4 years. She played about 3 years, and she already had developed an encephalopathy, which was a change to the white matter in her brain, which then led to all the dysfunctions.
So that's a big door to open there. Then why? Maybe I'm asking the wrong person. Why do women's brains seem to be more susceptible to injury then, if that's what you're saying?
I mean, that's a matter for science, and also medicine. But clearly, on the research that we've seen, this is the second death we've had from women playing football. The first one was a cerebral blood bleed by Maggie Varco, which was preventable, but at the game, nobody had the expertise or skill to understand, that she had a significant trauma and should have been immediately shipped off, to hospital, not sent back in the sheds and start drinking beer.
Right. So she was the one who collapsed in the change rooms afterwards and passed away as a result of the brain hemorrhage. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Are there not the same medical standards around the women's football?
Well, I mean, what I've been trying to say to people is that, we should be, as it stands now, is that the women's game has been devolved from a men's game, and you have men's, coaching women to play like men. I mean, quite simply, what I don't understand is why we don't have, some very smart women create a women's game that protects them, still has all the skill base, and, that they don't finish up damaged. I mean, if you have a look and see, the injury statistics, we had women last year who had fractured sternums. That's a car crash. It's nuts.
That's incredible. What do the women who hear you speak say about this? Because,
well,
I imagine they want to play football and they've only just got their foot in the door and opening that up and becoming mainstream.
The social dynamics are that I'm a male and I shouldn't be telling women what to do, and I accept that. But what I'm saying is that look at the science and look at the medicine and understand the risks that you're taking, because, and that's exactly what I said to the AFL. You started this off without fully appreciating that it's unsafe. I mean, you've already got the fact that the AFL knows it's not safe because they've changed the return to play protocols from 6 to 12. Mm-hmm. And we have a complete lack of leadership from WorkSafe who I said that in 2019, that the return to play protocols are unsafe with 6 days. You need to look at all of the science and assess whether it's a safe workplace. I mean, it's an industrial disease. This is no different to what we found with asbestosis. It's a long, slow burn that takes about 20 or 30 years to develop its full extent of the damage.
It's a hideous way to die.
Well, I mean, the thing is this, is that we're seeing people, I mean, we are seeing people who have a loss of quality of life in their 40s.
Yeah.
When they start the early stages of, dementia. And when trauma is the basis of the dementia outcome, it's irreversible.
Mm-hmm.
There's only one way, and that's downhill.
Rapidly. What would you like to see happen going forward, just as a final question to you, Peter?
I don't think we've got enough time, Tanya. I mean, it's at every level of the game, and and every level of the community. Is that we've just got to get better at it.
Better at looking after our humans. Better looking after our players. Better.
Like the whole theory of football was devolved, 150 years ago, from two groups of men, meeting in a park with a ball and belting the shit out of each other. So, and it's all morphed into, that has not changed. Is it you run around, you throw a ball in there. I mean, take Paddy McCartan, for instance. I mean, his coward punch on that guy would normally have resulted in him being incarcerated for 3 months for assault. Right. But on a football field, it's ignored, and he gets a 5-week penalty not to play. And he's belted the suitcase out of this bloke, who we don't know what the long-term damage will be. It could be, but not likely to be, the start of something very dangerous for him.
A lot of people would say that you don't like football. Would that be true?
No, that's bullshit. I mean, what I like to see is make it safe.
How do we make it safe?
Well, that's what I just said, is that, we've got lots of smart people who've put people on the moon. Surely we can look at the biomechanics and make it safe. And
for starters, change the, have it so that that sort of thing. So if someone is doing a king hit on somebody on the football field, they get the same penalties as what someone would if they did it on the street.
Correct. I mean, or even, report it to the police to stop people doing it. I mean, it's nuts. The fact that you've got a white circle or a white line around, the oval doesn't mean to say that you can, behave in such a antisocial manner, that you are judged by your peers in a completely archaic manner.
Protected. Do you think that we can reach a point where we can play the game safely?
Well, of course, that's what we've got to aim for, or else we won't be talking about it with the next generation. They'll be playing it on a video console, using past games as a model.
And it could be debated that that good people could be worse for their brains than the traumatic injuries that they're getting now from the AFL.
Well, probably not, because you can recover from it because it's not trauma induced.
Yeah, that's another whole conversation, because I think I've got not another opinion, but I think that that's there's lots of different elements to that as well. Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Other than you're well